In mid-February 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat in a cramped command post near the Tunisian border and began a letter to his wife, Lucy. Outside, the Afrika Korps was in a rare mood of celebration. They had just smashed through American positions at Kasserine Pass, and the desert air carried the sound of men who believed they had rediscovered the old formula: strike hard, move fast, and watch the enemy fold. Inside, Rommel's mood was colder. Victory never made him sentimental. It made him analytical. He wrote with blunt precision that the Americans were soft, that they lacked real training, and that their officers were committing amateur mistakes that would have earned court-martials in a European army. He had just watched American formations break and run at Kasserine. Over 6,000 American casualties in 6 days. Entire battalions surrendering. Equipment abandoned where it stood, as if the army had simply evaporated under pressure. To Rommel, it resembled the collapse he had watched from the French in 1940. The Americans didn't merely lose, they were humiliated. And humiliation was more dangerous than defeat because it seeped into the mind. Men who had grown up on stories of World War I heroism were now asking themselves whether they were cut out for this kind of war at all. Rommel didn't see only a tactical opening. He believed he was watching the American spirit crack in real time, watching confidence drain out of a new army before it could harden into something unbreakable. In his letter, he told Lucy that if Germany could launch another offensive within weeks, they could push the Americans into the sea before they learned how to fight properly. It was not an emotional taunt. It was a recommendation. The assessment was forwarded to Berlin in the language German headquarters understood best. Exploit American weakness immediately. Do not give them time to adapt. Rommel's judgment was not built on prejudice. It was built on observed performance. At Kasserine Pass, the Americans had displayed failures that, to German eyes, were almost textbook. Commanders positioned units poorly and then failed to correct the mistakes when the battlefield changed. Radio discipline collapsed under pressure, turning communications into a storm of confusion. Coordination between infantry and armor was thin at best and non-existent at worst. When German forces attacked, American units retreated without orders, and unordered retreat created the one thing every commander fears: cascading panic. In the center of that dysfunction was the American Second Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, who had built his headquarters in a canyon roughly 70 miles behind the front. He fought the battle through radios and telephones without seeing the battlefield. His orders arrived late, conflicted with each other, and sometimes contradicted the reality his men were facing. German intelligence officers compiled detailed reports. The equipment looked adequate. The soldiers sometimes fought bravely when cornered. But the command structure, how the army thought, moved, and responded, was amateur. These were soldiers learning modern war in real time, and they were learning it against Germany's best. Rommel calculated that it would take them at least half a year to fix leadership problems, and likely a full year to develop doctrine that could survive the Wehrmacht's rhythm. If Germany struck again in early spring, the results, he believed, would look like Kasserine all over again. German armored doctrine had proven itself against every opponent since 1939. Concentrate superior force at a weak point. Break through with armored spearheads. Exploit the breach with mobile formations. Force the enemy to retreat or be encircled. The method had shattered French armies in 6 weeks. It had destroyed Soviet armies in 1941. It had shoved British forces across North Africa twice. It worked because most armies defended in the same instinctive way, trying to hold lines that German mobility could bypass. Kasserine had shown the Americans fought that way too. They built defensive positions and waited to be hit. When German armor concentrated, The Americans withdrew rather than counterattacked. To Rommel, that meant predictability, and predictability meant opportunity. He studied the terrain around El Guetter in central Tunisia and saw a stage built for a repeat performance. If German forces attacked there in late March, they would catch American units still recovering from Kasserine. The psychological advantage alone would be decisive. Berlin approved his assessment. One more offensive, they believed, would break American morale completely. Then Germany could shift weight back toward the British, while the Americans shipped their defeated army home in shame. And then, in early March, German intelligence reported something that complicated the story: a command change. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. had taken command of the American Second Corps on March 6, 1943, the same corps that had collapsed at Kasserine. Patton did not arrive quietly. When he rolled into headquarters, the atmosphere changed before he even spoke. The motorcade came with a siren blaring, a deliberate theatrical warning. Patton wore his ivory-handled revolvers as if they were part of his rank, and he carried himself like a man who believed defeat was not only unacceptable, but contagious. He didn't issue gentle guidance. He issued an ultimatum. The era of the soft American was over. He enforced discipline with a ferocity that startled even his own officers. Men wore ties and regulation helmets in the desert heat. Not because Patton cared about vanity, but because he cared about identity. He wanted soldiers to feel like professionals, not defeated refugees. Officers who arrived without proper uniform were fined on the spot. Soldiers who failed to salute were reprimanded publicly. Patton understood something Rommel also understood. Morale is not a speech. It is a system of expectations. The Germans, however, believed time was on their side. One general could not fix systemic problems in 3 weeks. That was the enemy's calculation. Patton might stiffen discipline. He might raise spirits. But he could not, in their view, teach an entire corps new doctrine in less than a month. Rommel's health was failing. His stomach ailments and exhaustion grew worse by the day, but his tactical mind remained sharp. Before turning operational control over to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel reviewed the El Guetter plan one last time. The plan assumed American defense would be passive. It assumed hesitation under pressure. It assumed that 3 weeks was not enough to transform an army. Every assumption seemed logical, based on German experience against nearly every opponent they had faced. On March 22, 1943, German forces prepared to strike American positions near El Guetter. The order of battle included the 10th Panzer Division with Mark V tanks and the experienced Italian Centauro Division. German commanders briefed their units on what they expected to see. Americans dug in, fixed on holding ground, calling for air support that might not arrive. If pressure rose, the Americans would retreat the way they had at Kasserine. The German tanks carried superior firepower and armor protection. German 75mm guns could penetrate Sherman armor at roughly 2,000 yards. The Sherman's gun often needed to close to about 500 for reliable penetration. In open desert terrain, that technical advantage looked decisive. Artillery plans were prepared to suppress American positions. The entire operation was designed around what had worked before: pressure, shock, and the belief that the enemy's nerve would fail first. On March 23, 1943, dawn broke over El Guetter, and German forces advanced expecting another victory. They were about to discover that 3 weeks could be enough time to change everything that mattered. The attack began around 6 in the morning. Lead elements of the 10th Panzer rolled forward toward American positions held by the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Visibility was good. The terrain favored armored movement. The situation matched the briefing. Then American artillery opened fire, and it was not the hesitant ranging fire Germans expected from an army still finding its confidence. It was coordinated, concentrated time-on-target salvos, multiple batteries landing on German positions at the same instant, as if the desert itself had learned to strike in unison. Every gun in the corps could focus on a single point at the same second. German units that still relied heavily on horse-drawn systems could not replicate that kind of coordination at that scale. The accuracy was shocking. The volume was devastating. Tanks took direct hits. Infantry units called urgently for medical evacuation. This was not an enemy collapsing. This was an enemy firing with the precision of a machine that had been tuned. The Americans were not being suppressed. They were observing, adjusting, and striking back with professionalism that suggested trained forward observers and crews who understood their jobs down to the smallest detail. The 10th Panzer kept advancing anyway. This, too, was expected. Resistance was normal. German commanders believed sustained pressure would trigger the familiar chain reaction. Confusion, retreat, panic. Orders went out to push through the artillery storm and close with American positions. Then, American tank destroyers opened fire from concealed locations. Mark V tanks began taking flank shots. The Americans had not placed anti-tank weapons in obvious positions that armor could simply blast apart. They had built crossfires, angles that made German armor vulnerable no matter which way it turned. It was the first sign that the enemy was not playing the old role. By mid-morning, the German advance had pushed roughly 2,000 yards into American positions. That kind of penetration was typical in a major offensive, but the Americans did not run. They conducted fighting withdrawals to prepared secondary lines. They gave ground with purpose rather than panic. For the men of the Big Red One, El Gueter was not simply a battle. It was an exorcism. These were many of the same soldiers who had tasted humiliation at Kasserine and lived with the sour memory of it. Now, as panzer formations rolled toward them, they did not scan the horizon for escape routes. They locked onto their sights. Fear had been replaced by something colder, professional rage, disciplined and focused, the kind that keeps men in place even when everything around them explodes. German radio intercepts captured American communications, and the tone startled intelligence officers, calm, clear, tactical. Officers gave concise orders. Units reported positions, coordinated fields of fire, and moved with a coherence that had not existed weeks earlier. It was not the frantic chatter of Kasserine. American infantry held under fire until ordered to withdraw. When they pulled back, they did not scatter. They moved to new positions and resumed fighting, preserving cohesion while forcing German armor to pay for every yard. On the right flank, the Italian Centauro division reported heavy resistance. Their infantry found themselves pinned by counterfire. When Italian units tried to advance, American machine gun positions opened from overlapping fields. The battlefield had been prepared properly, like a trap that tightened instead of snapping once. By midday, the German advance had stalled at roughly 3,000 yards. This was not the breakthrough the memory of Kasserine had promised. Von Arnim, now commanding German forces in Tunisia, after Rommel's departure, received report after report from El Gueter. The attack was not achieving its objectives. American resistance was organized and punishing. Casualties climbed without the corresponding collapse German planners had expected. The intelligence picture did not match the reality coming in from the front. Von Arnim studied the tactical summaries with rising concern. The Shermans were still outgunned. The terrain was not radically different from Kasserine. Yet the Americans fought with coordination and aggression that German commanders had not anticipated. Intercepts showed American leaders issuing confident orders. Artillery concentrated with brutal precision. Infantry counterattacked, rather than merely clung to ground. This was not a demoralized army shaken by its first real defeat. This was an army that had learned, and learning, fast learning, was the one thing German doctrine did not like to face, because it erased the advantage of experience. By the following day, March 24, 1943, von Arnim's staff recommended calling the offensive off. German losses were too high for too little gain. The Americans were too strong in their positions. The attack was suspended, and German forces withdrew. What was supposed to be a repeat of Kasserine ended as something far more unsettling. Proof that the opponent had changed shape. German intelligence immediately tried to understand what had happened. They interviewed captured Americans. They searched documents recovered from the field. They were looking for the obvious answer: a shipment of new equipment, a surge of reinforcements, months of training. But none of that was there. The Americans had not received a miracle delivery. They had not been rebuilt from scratch. The transformation had occurred in 21 days under Patton's command, and the simplicity of that fact made it frightening. Patton's method was direct, even brutal in its clarity. First came a leadership purge. Officers who hesitated were removed. Those who attacked were promoted. Command positions went to men who understood that speed and aggression decided battles before technical details could. Second came a doctrinal revolution at unit level. Counterattack immediately when attacked. Artillery was trained to concentrate fire for overwhelming effect at decisive points. Defense was redefined as active. Aggressive patrolling, spoiling attacks, constant pressure. Never passive waiting. Third came psychological transformation. Patton convinced soldiers they were superior, not by speech-making alone, but by training that rewarded aggression and punished caution. Units that performed well were praised publicly. Officers who failed were relieved without delay. The entire corps absorbed one lesson like a new instinct. Attack succeeds. Hesitation fails. German commanders analyzed what El-Guettar revealed about American capability. The Germans relied on concentrated armor to break through weak points. The Americans responded with mobile anti-tank weapons positioned to create crossfire, making armored superiority expensive, no matter how impressive the tank. German doctrine assumed defenders would retreat under sustained pressure. Patton's doctrine forced immediate counterattacks that disrupted momentum. What looked like a controlled advance became a fight for survival. Germans emphasized individual skill and technical superiority. Americans emphasized coordination and massed firepower. Where German pride focused on the panzer commander, Americans answered with time-on-target artillery. Industrial precision applied to violence. For German infantry, it felt as if the sky itself had turned against them. They were not fighting isolated soldiers. They were fighting a coordinated machine that had finally found its rhythm. Rommel, before leaving Tunisia, revised his assessment. The Americans had learned faster than any opponent Germany had faced. They had identified weaknesses at Kasserine and corrected them in weeks. Any future offensive against American forces would require more resources, different tactics, and less reliance on the old assumption that pressure alone would crack them. And the timing carried an almost symbolic cruelty. On March 6, 1943, two critical events unfolded nearly side by side. In Tunisia, Rommel launched his final offensive in North Africa at Medellin against the British Eighth Army, and it collapsed in a single day under coordinated anti-tank fire. The same day, George Patton assumed command of the American Second Corps. Rommel's exit from the center of the North African struggle and Patton's entrance into it happened at the same moment. as if the campaign itself was turning a page. 3 days later, on March 9, 1943, Rommel flew back to Germany on sick leave. His jaundice and exhaustion had worsened. He would not return to Africa. Before leaving, he wrote updated notes for the commanders who remained. The tone was different from the sharp mockery of his February letter. He warned that American forces under new leadership were improving rapidly and should not be expected to break the way they had at Kasserine. His warning arrived too late to stop the Elgeter offensive, but the battle validated the direction of his new judgment. The Americans had changed, and they were not changing slowly. On May 13, 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered, over 250,000 prisoners. The North African campaign was over. The Americans had gone from humiliation at Kasserine in February to victory in Tunisia in May, a transformation measured in weeks rather than years. German commanders studied the performance and issued new tactical guidance. Expect aggressive American tactics, rapid armored movement, concentrated artillery. Germany began adapting because the old assumptions had become dangerous. When Allied forces landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, the warnings proved accurate. Under Patton's 7th Army, American forces advanced rapidly along the western coast. Patton's troops reached Messina on August 17, 1943, beating British forces in a race that made American arms look fast, confident, and, worst of all for German morale, inevitable. German defenders reported that American aggression combined with superior logistics made static defense feel like trying to hold back a tide with bare hands. By June 1944, Rommel was in a different role, facing a different nightmare. He commanded German forces defending France against Allied invasion. The man who had once dismissed Americans as soft now deployed defensive doctrines specifically designed to counter American speed and pressure. He positioned mobile reserves near likely beaches because he believed the Americans would drive inland rapidly after landing. German forces, he knew, would have to counterattack immediately before the Americans could establish momentum. His assessment of the Americans had changed completely from the mid-February 1943 letter to Lucy. He now wrote that American forces had shown themselves more advanced in tactical thinking than the British, combining material superiority with an aggressive application of force that made static defense ineffective. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, Rommel's preparations were undermined by Hitler's refusal to release panzer reserves at the critical moment. Yet Rommel's read of the Americans proved accurate. American forces at Utah and Omaha pushed inland with relentless urgency despite heavy casualties. Rommel understood what other German generals were still struggling to accept. The Americans were no longer the shaky, poorly coordinated army he had watched fracture at Kasserine. They were a professional force whose doctrine was designed to turn industrial capacity into tactical inevitability. After Germany surrendered, Allied interrogators questioned German generals about American performance. The testimony carried a consistent undertone, almost like a confession of miscalculation. Men who had expected Americans to resemble the French collapse of 1940 or the early Soviet disasters of 1941 admitted they had faced an opponent that evolved at a speed that felt unfair. German commanders who had fought Americans in 1944 and 1945 described a pattern, weaknesses identified and corrected in weeks, not months. They emphasized artillery coordination as the most effective they encountered, the speed of concentrating fire making German methods feel outdated. The American transformation, they said, was not simply a matter of better equipment. Others had good tanks and experienced soldiers. What made the Americans decisive was the combination. material advantage harnessed by doctrine that demanded aggression, coordination, and momentum. The same army that broke at Kasserine became, by the end of the war, one of the most effective fighting forces on Earth. Germany didn't just lose a campaign. In a deeper sense, it lost the comfort of superiority, the belief that experience and technical excellence would always outweigh an enemy's capacity to learn. Rommel's initial assessment after Kasserine had been logical by the standards of history. Armies usually needed years to build effective doctrine. Officers usually needed long experience to lead cleanly. Soldiers usually needed months of hard training to fight like professionals. Patton shattered that expectation in 3 weeks by changing the variables that mattered most: leadership, doctrine, and mindset. Elgeter revealed the new reality, and the months that followed proved it wasn't temporary. From the shame at Kasserine in February to the surrender in Tunisia in May, the timeline was short, but the consequences were permanent. By May 13, 1943, as hundreds of thousands of Axis troops laid down their arms, German professionals understood the Americans who had panicked at Kasserine were gone. Leadership mattered more than experience. Doctrine mattered more than equipment. Aggressive mindset mattered more than technical superiority. The Germans built better tanks, but the Americans built a system that made the tank duel only one piece of a larger machine. At Elgeter, doctrine beat firepower. It beat it again in Sicily. It beat it in Normandy. It beat it across France and into Germany. The months between humiliation and triumph did more than change a campaign. They changed the century's trajectory. It was the moment the arsenal of democracy found its sword, and the moment German generals stopped underestimating the man across the foxhole. Because by the spring of 1943, they realized he wasn't a tourist in uniform. He was learning, adapting, and becoming the architect of their inevitable defeat.